You've been in relationships with some from famous women. You've dated some of the biggest superstars of all time. Anything you can share with us about Cher?
Weren't you dating Cher before that? And did you
Yeah.
cheat on Cher with
Of course.
Diana Ross?
Of course.
Yes.
By the summer of 1980, a People magazine profile on Kiss reported that Gene Simmons was living with Diana Ross and her daughters. Cher, in an excruciating detail, was described as having attended a Kiss rehearsal around the same time alongside Diana Ross. For a brief period, by some accounts, all three appeared to be navigating the situation with a level of public civility that concealed an enormous amount of private damage. The friendship between Cher and Diana Ross did not survive it. Whatever graciousness existed on the surface during those months, the relationship between the two women ended permanently. Gene managed to remain on speaking terms with both of them separately, which says something about his ability to compartmentalize, if nothing else. The question of why Gene never married Cher is slightly more complicated than it first appears, because for much of their time together, neither of them was particularly pushing for marriage. Cher had been through two marriages that had both ended badly. By 1979, she had publicly stated that she had what she described as a very liberated attitude to relationships. She acknowledged that Gene occasionally spent time with other women while on tour, and that she had her own occasional companionship outside the relationship. This was not a secret arrangement. She discussed it openly with the press. Gene's position on marriage was similarly unambiguous, and it was a position he held for a very long time. He famously paraphrased Groucho Marx when asked about it, saying that marriage was an institution, and he did not want to live in an institution. He repeated versions of that line for decades. His relationship with Shannon Tweed, which began in 1983, lasted 28 years before they finally married in 2011. And even then the catalyst was partly Shannon walking off a live television interview in frustration after Gene made a dismissive comment about the topic on air. The wedding happened a few months later. So the honest answer to why Gene never married Cher is layered. Part of it is simply that Gene Simmons, during the years he and Cher were together, was not a man who wanted to get married to anyone. His lifestyle, his values at the time, and his self-admitted complete self-absorption made the kind of commitment marriage requires something he was not prepared for. Cher herself understood this. She has spoken about Gene with warmth and without bitterness in the years since, describing him as charming, intelligent, and someone she still thinks fondly of. But the other part of the answer is what the Christmas errand revealed. The relationship ended not because Gene made a conscious decision that he did not want to marry Cher, but because he made a series of decisions that made marriage or any continuation of the relationship impossible. He has reflected on this in various interviews over the years with a degree of honesty that is unusual for someone of his public profile. He has described what he did as self-absorbed and disrespectful. He has acknowledged that he had a unique opportunity with someone genuinely remarkable and used it badly. When asked after his eventual marriage to Shannon Tweed what he had been afraid of all those years, he looked at his wedding ring and said he genuinely did not know. Shannon Tweed, and what finally changed him, became the next chapter of Gene Simmons' life. Gene Simmons met Shannon Tweed in 1983 at the Playboy Mansion. She was a Canadian actress and had been the Playboy Playmate of the Year in 1982. By this point, Gene had already been through his relationship with Cher, then Diana Ross, and a long roster of other women that he has, with characteristic lack of modesty, put it somewhere around 5,000. He was not, by any external measure, a man who appeared to be moving towards settling down. What happened with Shannon was different, and Gene has talked about why at some length. The relationship started like many of his others, but it did not end like them. Shannon stayed. She stayed through behavior that, by Gene's own admission in a 2018 interview, would have caused most people to walk away. He described himself during those first 29 years of their relationship as a jackass, self-absorbed, carousing, doing anything he pleased with no real consideration for anyone else. Shannon, he said, forgave his trespasses over and over in a way he found genuinely astonishing, and which he attributed to a capacity for seeing the bigger picture that he felt most men simply do not have. The arrival of their children shifted things further. Their son Nick was born in 1989, their daughter Sophie in 1992. Gene has said that having children began to restructure his understanding of what he actually wanted from his life, not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually and with real weight. The reality show Gene Simmons' Family Jewels, which aired from 2006 to 2012, gave audiences an unusually unfiltered view of how that dynamic actually worked. Shannon did not let things pass without comment. There were arguments on camera, moments of genuine friction, and at least one incident where she walked off a live television set mid-interview rather than sit next to Gene while he made dismissive comments about marriage. The wedding finally happened in 2011 at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Afterward, Gene said something that cut to the core of an entire decades-long story, not just with Shannon, but with Cher and with everyone who came before. He looked at his wedding band and said he genuinely could not understand what he had been afraid of for so long. That question, what he was afraid of, is probably the most honest answer he has ever given to why he never married Cher. It was not strategy. It was not indifference. It was fear dressed up as freedom for a very long time until he finally ran out of excuses. What both of them say about it now is perhaps the most interesting part of the story, because both Gene and Cher are still here, still talking, and still reflecting on what those 2 years in the late 1970s actually meant. Cher's 2024 memoir treated the relationship with Gene in detail, and, crucially, without anger. She wrote about the Christmas errand, about the shift to Diana Ross, and about what it felt like to process that loss. She has described Gene in recent years as charming and intelligent, using what sounds like genuine affection rather than diplomatic courtesy. She even took partial credit in later interviews for Kiss's decision to reunite in 1996, pointing out that she had encouraged it. The woman Gene left still speaks of him kindly, which perhaps says more about Cher's character than anything else in this story. Gene, for his part, has become increasingly reflective about that period as he has gotten older. In a 2023 interview with The Guardian, he said he would never leave Shannon, not even if she cheated on him, because his definition of marriage had nothing to do with conventional notions of loyalty as transaction. He said his marriage would be the only one he ever had, full stop. That is a very different man from the one who was running up $2,800 phone bills from Japan and then walking into his girlfriend's best friend's apartment and eating 2 slices of chocolate cake on the way to derailing everything. Shannon herself has spoken about the Cher years without apparent resentment, which is its own remarkable thing. Looking back, the story of Gene Simmons and Cher is not really a story about marriage at all. It is a story about timing, maturity, and the difference between finding the right person and being the right person. By almost every account, Gene and Cher shared a genuine connection. They enjoyed each other's company, built a life together, and spoke openly about their affection. Yet even strong relationships can be undermined when one person is not ready for the responsibilities that come with commitment. Gene has admitted as much in later years. His reflections suggest that he understands now what he could not understand then. Cher represented stability, affection, and a future that many people would have embraced without hesitation. But Gene was still chasing freedom, or at least what he believed freedom looked like. The irony is that years later, after finally settling down with Shannon Tweed, he discovered that many of the fears that had driven his decisions were never as significant as he had imagined. That realization came decades too late to change what happened with Cher, but it has clearly shaped the way he thinks about relationships today. In the end, the reason Gene Simmons never married Cher was not because she was not important enough, not because the relationship lacked love, and not because marriage itself was impossible. It was because Gene Simmons, at that stage of his life, was not prepared to become the person required to make that commitment last. The relationship ended, the lives of everyone involved moved forward, and history took its course. Yet decades later, both Gene and Cher continue to speak about those years with honesty, warmth, and reflection, suggesting that while the romance may not have survived, the significance of what they shared never completely disappeared.